On a peaceful Thursday afternoon in Greenwood, Ohio, Derek Johnson, a rather reclusive man, was relaxing after a long day of work. He was standing by the house, phone in hand, checking the Wi-Fi connection. For the past few weeks, his connection had been slow, interrupted during video calls and sluggish when streaming music. When he opened the router settings, he discovered an unfamiliar device connected to his network. Greenwood I-01, the device was named, and Derek didn't recognize it. He lived alone and had never shared his Wi-Fi password with anyone. Frustrated, he immediately removed the device from the network and changed the password. With this simple action, he had no idea that things would quickly escalate into a surprising and dangerous investigation right in his own neighborhood. Greenwood, Ohio, a quiet, residential neighborhood, was unremarkable except for its charming houses, lush gardens, and friendly neighbors. But for Derek Johnson, this was the place he chose to live a peaceful, quiet life, away from the hustle and bustle. As a man who cherished tranquility, he rarely participated in community activities and always kept a distance from those around him. His time was mostly spent in his home office, with work being rather stressful. But at least he didn't have to worry about the inconveniences of the outside world. One Thursday afternoon, after a tense morning of work, Derek decided to relax by checking his Wi-Fi speed. Recently, he had noticed his connection was very slow, frequently interrupted during video calls, and often disconnected while streaming music. He assumed the problem lay with his service provider, but the calmness of that afternoon made him feel like something was off. He opened an app on his phone and accessed the router settings. What he saw unsettled him. An unfamiliar device was connected to his Wi-Fi network. A very strange name. Greenwood I-01. Derek checked the connected devices and saw no names he recognized. He lived alone, and aside from his phone, computer, and TV, there were no other devices. This made him suspect that someone was illegally using his Wi-Fi. Frustrated, Derek decided to immediately kick the unfamiliar device off the network and change the Wi-Fi password. He stepped outside to get a stronger signal from the router, leaning against his car in the driveway, and quietly entered the new password on his phone. From the kitchen window, Rebecca Miller, a neighbor of Derek, saw him standing there, eyes focused on his phone screen. She felt like something was off. Rebecca wasn't one to typically notice the actions of others, but Derek was different. He was the stranger in the neighborhood, not attending any of the neighborhood parties, not greeting anyone, and always keeping a certain distance from everyone. It wasn't normal for a stranger to stand outside for so long with no clear reason. Rebecca felt something was wrong, and even though she wasn't sure what he was doing, the feeling in her gut made her unable to ignore it. She quickly grabbed her phone and called 911. "Hello, I'd like to report a suspicious activity. My neighbor is standing in the yard, seemingly doing something odd with his phone. I don't know what he's doing, but it seems really strange. Could you send someone to check it out?" The call ended quickly, and just a few minutes later, a police car pulled up in front of Derek's house. As the police car slowly stopped in front of Derek's house, he paid no attention to the siren, too absorbed in the phone in his hand. It wasn't until two figures appeared in front of him that he finally looked up. It was Detective Jacob Larson, a tall man with a sharp gaze, accompanied by Officer Anna Carter, a petite but formidable woman. Both wore serious expressions and had an air of suspicion about them. Derek let out a long, weary sigh, realizing things had gone too far. He stood still, unsure of how to react as they approached. Still, he tried to remain calm. Larson spoke first. "Derek Johnson, right? We received a call reporting suspicious behavior. Can you explain what you're doing?" Derek looked at them in surprise. I'm just changing my Wi-Fi password," he said, his voice tinged with sarcasm, but still trying to keep his composure. Both Larson and Carter showed no emotion on their faces, but suspicion lingered. Larson scrutinized Derek closely before glancing over at the car in Derek's driveway, a clear indication that he lived there. "Are you sure you haven't done anything suspicious?" Larson asked. Feeling the tension rise, Derek replied, "I've lived here for 3 years. I haven't done anything wrong." At that moment, a voice interrupted from across the street. It was Rebecca Miller, standing on her porch, watching them with a skeptical look. She turned back toward the police and began to speak. He's always standing out there, looking around sneakily, sometimes just staring at his phone without saying a word. I don't know what he's doing, but my gut never lies." Derek stared at Rebecca, unable to believe what she had just said. "I'm not doing anything wrong. She doesn't understand," he muttered under his breath. Larson turned back to look at Rebecca, suspicious but unable to dismiss her words. "Has he done anything illegal?" Larson asked. Rebecca hesitated, glancing at Derek, then shook her head. "I don't know, but I just feel like something's not right. He always stands out there like he's watching someone." Officer Carter looked at Derek, trying to gather more information. "Maybe we should check your router to clarify everything." Derek sighed once more, his frustration starting to build again. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he knew that resisting could make things worse in situations like this. "Fine. Check it," he said, his voice lowering. He unlocked his phone, then opened the router settings, showing Larson and Carter the devices connected to his network. Everything seemed normal until Larson stopped and focused on one name in the connection list. Greenwood I-01. His expression changed immediately. "Do you recognize this name?" Larson asked, his voice sharp. Derek looked at the phone screen, then back at Larson with a confused look. "No, I don't. I live alone and haven't given my password to anyone." Carter stepped closer, her gaze probing, and began to inspect the details of the connected devices. "If this device isn't yours, then who's using your Wi-Fi?" she asked, her tone turning more serious. Derek felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. "Someone's intruding on my network. Not only am I losing Wi-Fi, but I might also be getting watched," he said, his voice lowering. The air seemed to grow heavier. Both Larson and Carter fell silent, their eyes fixed on Derek's phone. At that moment, they all realized that this wasn't just a simple report of a lost Wi-Fi connection. It was something much more serious. Something big and dangerous was lurking behind what Derek had accidentally uncovered. The situation had now escalated beyond anything Derek could have imagined. All three of them stood in silence, their eyes fixed on his phone, and in that moment, the air seemed to grow heavy. Larson and Carter continued to inspect the network connections, but their growing unease was becoming more evident. The words on Derek's screen had left them no choice but to take it seriously. Greenwood I-01. "What is this device?" Larson asked, his voice no longer as composed as it had been before. Derek glanced at the phone, but still didn't recognize the device. "I don't know, it's not mine," he replied, his face tense. An uneasy feeling washed over Derek. He had never seen this name before, and it made him feel that something was amiss. Carter leaned closer, continuing to scrutinize the list of connected devices. "This isn't a normal Wi-Fi device. It's active continuously, not like the usual temporary connections. It's almost as if it's monitoring something," she said, her voice now more serious than ever. Derek remained silent, but his eyes were glued to the phone screen, almost waiting for some kind of logical explanation. Truly, he couldn't fathom what was happening. Why would someone want to use his Wi-Fi, and even more so, monitor what he was doing? "We need to look deeper," Larson said, looking up from the phone. "Maybe we should check your security cameras." Derek didn't want to go down this path, but he understood that things had already gone too far. He pointed to the laptop on the table where he had his security camera management program open. "Here, take a look," Derek said, his finger gliding across the screen as he opened the list of cameras in his house. Both Larson and Carter moved closer, their eyes fixed on the screen. The logs in the connection journal appeared like an open book. And that's when Larson stopped, staring intently at one particular line, before turning back to Carter with a look of suspicion. "This can't be a coincidence," Larson said, his voice tense. "Someone's been monitoring your security cameras, and if they're monitoring your cameras, they're definitely not just watching you." Carter carefully reviewed the logs, then nodded. "It's not just your cameras. There are a lot of other devices involved. I think we need to investigate these connections immediately." The three of them quickly began investigating further, as Derek opened the connection logs to search for any signs of abnormal activity. In a brief moment, Larson suddenly froze, his face changing completely. "Derek, you need to see this. There's an unknown IP address. It's not yours." Derek looked at the screen and saw a name he had never encountered. Greenwood Spy. A cold shiver ran down his spine. This was no ordinary Wi-Fi attack. Someone in this neighborhood was watching him, and it seemed like they weren't just watching him alone. "What is this?" Derek whispered, his hands gripping the phone tightly. "Can you take a look at the connection log here?" Larson asked, his eyes scanning through the other IP addresses quickly. "I think we're dealing with a network intruder." At that moment, Rebecca, who had been silent up until then, began to feel a wave of dread. Everything was spiraling out of control in ways she couldn't have imagined. Seeing this new sign, she felt panic rising. He's been watching all of us?" Derek turned to look at her, his face now cold. "I think whoever's behind this isn't just watching me. They're watching the entire neighborhood." Rebecca took a step back, feeling like everything around her was collapsing. She had never imagined that her suspicions could lead to such a horrifying truth. She stood there wide-eyed, unable to utter a word. "Don't panic," Larson said, his eyes still glued to the screen. "What we need to do now is figure out who's behind all of this." Suddenly, a chilling thought flashed in Derek's mind. If these cameras have been compromised, then it's likely they know everything about us. They could be watching our every move, every word, every action. Carter shook her head, clearly unable to believe what was unfolding. If that's true, we're dealing with a serious breach, and this person isn't just monitoring one person. Derek took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had always thought his life would remain quiet, but now everything had changed. The atmosphere in Derek's house now felt as if it were sinking under the weight of rising tension. Everyone stood in silence. The only sounds were the heavy breaths and the clicking of the keyboard as Larson continued his search for signs of the intrusion. Each passing second felt heavier, as though the truth was slowly revealing itself, and no one could turn back now. Derek felt as though time had stopped. He stood there, staring at the laptop screen where the data continued to flash before his eyes. The name Greenwood Spy relentlessly spiraled in his mind, preventing him from stopping to think about what was happening. Finally, Larson spoke, his voice serious and no longer sounding like a simple investigation. "Derek, we need to clarify this further. If what I'm seeing here is true, then this person isn't just watching you. They're trying to infiltrate the entire security system of this neighborhood." Derek nodded, the weight in his chest growing heavier. They weren't just watching him. The name Greenwood Spy had triggered something far worse in him, something much darker. His thoughts spun in circles, but now he couldn't afford to lose control. He couldn't let fear take over. "Is anyone else in the neighborhood being watched?" Carter spoke up, her eyes tense as she examined the connections on the screen. Derek didn't answer immediately. His mind was spinning back to the discoveries they had just made. The sense of unease continued to rise, as if a shadow were lingering in the air. "We need to dig even deeper," Larson said, typing quickly on the keyboard. He worked in silence, his sharp eyes not leaving the screen, as though he was looking for something others hadn't noticed. Suddenly, Carter stopped. "There's something odd. Look at this," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. Derek rushed over, his eyes glued to the screen. The name Greenwood Spy appeared along with a series of other IP addresses. But what stunned him even more was a new line that appeared. Destination address, Brandon Foster's house. Derek felt the ground slip out from under him. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Brandon, one of the people he had assumed had nothing to do with this, was now a crucial link in everything. Brandon's address? Carter repeated, staring at the screen, unable to believe what she was seeing. Why would it be his house? Derek didn't respond. He just stared at the screen, then looked up at Larson and Carter. At this moment, everything seemed to be falling into place. Someone in this neighborhood, someone he had never suspected, was behind this intrusion. A cold wave of realization filled him. Rebecca? Larson spoke up, his gaze serious, as he turned to look at Derek's neighbor. We need to talk to Brandon, immediately. Rebecca couldn't believe her ears. She looked at the screen again, then back at Derek. Her face was full of concern, but then finally, the words slipped from her mouth. Brandon is my grandson. The three of them stood there in stunned silence, as if unable to believe what had just been said. Everything had become so unbelievable that no one could be certain they weren't dreaming. We need to go right now, Larson said, his voice firm and determined. We can't wait any longer. Derek stood there, dazed for a moment, then finally nodded. He knew now that he had no choice but to let the police handle the situation. Though still confused and unable to fully comprehend what was happening, he understood this was the only step to put an end to his suspicions. The drive to Brandon Foster's house unfolded in heavy silence. None of the three in the police car spoke a word. Derek's thoughts swirled in his mind like shards that couldn't be pieced together, making it impossible for him to focus. He couldn't believe that someone he had known, Rebecca's grandson, a person he'd never suspected, was the one behind all of this. The whole neighborhood had been monitored, infiltrated in such a subtle way, and the culprit was someone so close. Rebecca sat silently, her hand tightly gripping the armrest, her eyes glazed with tension. She couldn't bring herself to accept that Brandon, her grandson whom she had raised and helped over the years, could do something like this. But now, the undeniable evidence was clear. Guilt rose in her chest. How could I not have noticed? She wondered, her hands trembling. When the police car stopped in front of Brandon's house, Derek felt as if his heart was about to shatter. A wave of fear and unease washed over him. This was Brandon's house. A house that appeared peaceful on the outside, with no sign of anything unusual happening inside. But to Derek, it felt like a door to a terrifying truth. Larson wasted no time. He stepped out of the car and knocked firmly on the door. Standing beside him, Carter's sharp eyes missed nothing. The door opened, and there stood Brandon Foster. He looked surprised and a bit scared at the sight of the police. His messy hair, eyes shining with worry, and one hand running through his hair as though trying to hide something made him seem nervous. We need to talk to you, Brandon, Larson said in a stern voice, giving no room for Brandon to protest. What's going on? What is this about? Brandon asked, his voice tinged with confusion and a bit of unease. Carter stared at him intently, not letting him escape her scrutiny. We have reason to believe that you've infiltrated the security system of this neighborhood. Do you have anything to explain? Brandon looked at them, his eyes narrowing, his expression a mix of surprise and annoyance. What? Infiltrate the system? What are you talking about? His voice sounded panicked, but the anxiety was beginning to show through. We know you hacked into the neighborhood's security cameras, spying on people. Want to explain yourself? Larson said, his gaze never leaving Brandon. Brandon froze, his body stiffened, and his hands clenched. I didn't do anything wrong. It was just a prank, he said, his voice growing softer, as if trying to justify his actions. Carter furrowed her brow, not buying what Brandon was saying. A prank? You're telling me hacking into the neighborhood's security system, spying on families through their cameras, is a prank? You've accessed people's personal data, Brandon. That's not a joke. Brandon fell silent for a moment, his expression changing. The worry and fear on his face became more evident. He could no longer make excuses, and the truth was finally forced to come out. I just wanted to see if I could hack into someone else's Wi-Fi. I didn't think it would go this far, Brandon said, his voice confused and shaking. Derek stood silently, his heart clenched. He never could have imagined that Brandon was the one behind all of this. He couldn't believe that what had started as a prank had escalated into such a serious violation. Larson didn't let Brandon have the chance to continue his excuses. You've infiltrated the systems of other families, spied on them through their security cameras. Do you really think this is just a prank? You've broken the law. Brandon lowered his head, his hands trembling. I didn't know it would go this far. I was curious. Rebecca couldn't take it anymore. She stepped forward toward Brandon, her eyes welling up with tears. Brandon, why? Why would you do this? You've done things I can't even imagine. Why would you do this to the people in this neighborhood? Brandon looked down, his face reddening with shame. I didn't think it would go this far. I just wanted to see if I could hack into someone else's system. But now I really regret it, he said, his voice quiet, filled with remorse. Larson looked at Brandon, then turned to Derek, his eyes tired. Brandon Foster, I'm here to inform you that you're under arrest for hacking into security systems and spying on others without consent. Brandon said nothing more, standing there with a blank expression. The officers moved in, placing a hand on his shoulder, and began to escort him outside. The police led Brandon Foster away from his house, and the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt as though it were enveloped in a chilling silence. Rebecca stood frozen, her eyes following her grandson, unable to say a word. The entire neighborhood seemed to halt in that moment. She couldn't believe that the person she had raised, cared for, was the one responsible for this unforgivable breach. Derek stood to the side, his heart filled with anger and disappointment. He couldn't understand why Brandon would do something like this. How could a prank turn into such a serious criminal act? The sense of betrayal from those around him, from the neighbors, from people he had thought were harmless, made it impossible for him to stop thinking about it. This can't be real, Derek whispered to himself, his hands clenching into fists. He still couldn't believe that all of this had happened because of a simple action, changing a Wi-Fi password. Larson and Carter stood nearby, also silent, their eyes never leaving Brandon as he was escorted away. Finally, Larson spoke, his voice subdued. We've caught the culprit. But the issue isn't just with Brandon. We're dealing with something much bigger. Derek turned to look at Larson, confused. A bigger issue? This is a cyber attack, a serious violation. Larson sighed, his gaze filled with concern. Yes. But Brandon isn't the only one being exploited in this. He's part of a larger infiltration network. And I have reason to believe that others in this neighborhood may have been monitored without knowing it. Carter nodded, emphasizing the point. We've started checking the network devices in the area, and it's likely that many others have been hacked without their knowledge. These incidents aren't random. They have a purpose. Derek felt a shiver run down his spine. A part of him didn't want to believe what he was hearing, but everything he had witnessed was too clear to ignore. So there could be others in this neighborhood being watched like I was? Carter looked him in the eye, her voice serious. Yes, and we won't stop until we find out who's behind all of this. Rebecca finally spoke, her voice tired and choked with emotion. I can't believe it. How could my grandson do this? I gave him opportunities, raised him, helped him. He's lied to me and to everyone. Derek looked at Rebecca, understanding that her pain was immense. Her eyes were filled with disappointment and sorrow, knowing that Brandon, someone she had always considered family, was the one who had infiltrated and caused chaos in the neighborhood. Larson and Carter moved closer. "Rebecca, we'll do everything we can to resolve this," Larson reassured her. "But what's important now is helping everyone in the neighborhood understand that they may have been watched. We'll need everyone's cooperation." Derek moved closer to Rebecca, placing a hand on her shoulder in support. "We'll do everything we can to protect this neighborhood. What's happened isn't our fault, but we'll help the police get to the truth." Rebecca nodded silently, her eyes red, as a few tears began to fall down her cheeks. She felt as though everything around her was collapsing, but in that moment, she knew she had to stay strong. She couldn't let this pain defeat her. The police cars began to roll out of the neighborhood, carrying Brandon and part of the truth about the incident. Left behind, the peacefulness of the neighborhood had now been replaced with unanswered questions. Derek looked back at the place where he had once lived a quiet life and wondered whether everything he knew and believed was truly right. This story is not just about a Wi-Fi network breach, but a cautionary tale about carelessness and negligence in protecting personal information. Sometimes, seemingly harmless events can unravel terrifying secrets that we never could have imagined. Always stay vigilant, safeguard your personal data, and never let misguided assumptions ruin someone else's life. If this story made you reflect, don't forget to share your thoughts. Leave a comment to let us know where you live and what you think about this story. And remember to like and subscribe to keep receiving more intriguing stories and meaningful life lessons.